Dear all, thank you so much for being here today, in person and via streaming. I also wanted to thank the Ministry for Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge, the Spanish Climate Change Office, who is negotiating tirelessly as we speak, Fundación Biodiversidad, and all of the support team here today for this opportunity. It is our absolute pleasure and privilege at Elcano Royal Institute in Spain and at the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics to have been able to convene such an exceptional panel of speakers today. We're discussing a very important topic in this era of implementation: governance towards net zero and resilience. Our geographical focus today in the Spanish Pavilion, building on the events that we attended to yesterday, is on strengthening cooperation between Latin America and Spain. As you probably know, both the European Green Deal and Latin America will be key priorities in the Spanish presidency of the European Union next year. We know that climate policy has grown exponentially in the last 30 years. Developing robust legislation, learning about and disseminating good practices, understanding the impacts of climate policy on the private sector and society are key to meeting our globally agreed climate goals, especially so in this context of radical uncertainty, concatenated and interacting crises, a context in which, beyond the short-term responses geared towards providing energy security, we need to decide as a global community whether we are embracing the low-carbon transition or we're going to lock in high-carbon pathways that will mean asset stranding. The EU and Latin America and the Caribbean have helped advance climate negotiations at critical junctures in the past. They contribute, as you might know, to a fifth of global emissions. Among these two regions, there are disparities in climate ambition, energy mixes, socioeconomic context, natural and financial resources. However, the impacts of climate change both regions will endure. Their shared values and strong socioeconomic ties call for strengthening this bilateral cooperation and learning in a context of distributed climate leadership. Through Spain and networks such as the Ibero-American Network of Climate Change Offices, by bringing together stakeholders from countries with asymmetric levels of ambition that have on-the-ground experience in the implementation of low-carbon solutions, this event seeks to foster bi-directional learning, policy diffusion, and climate ambition. The questions that this panel will seek to answer are the following: what trends and elements of robust climate legislation can we see? Where can we see elements of robust climate legislation successfully implemented, and why? How have the COVID-19 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine affected climate policy? What are the impacts of and reactions to climate change and climate legislation by the private sector and citizens in the current context? And finally, how can we strengthen EU-LAC cooperation through Spain in order to further our globally agreed climate goals? I will now introduce our excellent panel of speakers in the order in which they will intervene today. Dr. Alina Verchenkova is a Senior Research Fellow at Elcano Royal Institute and Distinguished Policy Fellow, Lead Governance and Legislation at the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. She has 14 years of experience in climate policy and international development. She's worked as a program officer for the UNFCCC and supported international climate negotiations since 2012. She has extensive experience in providing advisory and capacity building services to governments, UN organizations, and the private sector, and in facilitating interministerial and multi-stakeholder dialogues on climate change. Dr. Ines Dombrowski is the head of program environmental governance at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS. Thank you so much for filling in for your colleague Gabriela, who's unfortunately sick with COVID. Dr. Dombrowski researches sustainable use of natural resources, multi-level environmental governance, integrated water resource management, transformation of water governance, transboundary water management, water, energy, food, climate nexus, and integrated implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Dr. Sandra Guzmán Luna is the founder of the Grupo de Financiamiento Climático para Latinoamérica y el Caribe, GFLAC, having previously worked as a manager for a climate policy initiative and as a consultant for the UNFCCC in climate finance. She's also former Director General for Climate Policies at the Environmental National Resources Secretariat in Mexico. Following that, Flavia Belaguarda is an International Relations Manager at Brazil's Central Climate Justice Consultant at Climate Reality in Brazil. She's also the founder of Youth Climate Leaders at La Clima, Latin American Climate Lawyers Initiative for Mobilizing Action. Mr. Miguel Muñoz, he's currently the head of Climate Policies and Alliances at the Chairman's Area at Iberdrola since 2015. He partakes actively in the Spanish Green Growth Group, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, UN Global Compact and Corporate Leaders Group. He's also a member of the board of the Spanish Association for Energy Economics, liaison delegate of the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, and European Climate Pact ambassador. Miguel will talk about the business sector and climate policy in the current context, as will Mr. David Rodoli, who is the Institutional Relations Director of Solaria. Prior to that, David was Chairman's Cabinet Director at the Spanish Nuclear Safety Council, an advisor to the VP of the Spanish Government, Ministry of the Presidency in 2007. So without further ado, and thank you again all for being here today. I know your schedules are absolutely manic these days, so thank you ever so much for this last push. Alina, please could you run us through the trends and elements in robust climate legislation and where we see cases of successful implementation and why?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. So as we approach the end of the COP27, I think we find ourselves in quite a worrying position. We know that in order to keep temperature increase below 1.5 degrees, we need a rapid and deep transformation of our economies globally towards decarbonization. We also need a very rapid implementation of measures to improve climate resilience of the economies. And COP26 in Glasgow last year, many countries have pledged net zero commitments and stepped up their NDCs. So we came out of Glasgow with quite a lot of hope, seeing that about 90% of the gross domestic product globally was actually covered by the net zero pledges. However, as we are here at the end of 2022, what we see is that the implementation has been lagging behind. Out of 126 countries that have committed to net zero, just 20 at the moment, according to Net Zero Tracker, have integrated their net zero goals into national climate laws. And a few more countries have integrated them into national policies. So we clearly have a governance gap. And if we look at the current commitments, even if we assume they will be implemented, the temperature increase will be around 1.8 degrees, the current net zero commitments. So the urgency is very clear. We need to step up national implementation, and governance is where we're seeing countries lagging behind at the moment. So from the governance point of view, there are three essential elements that are required for the world to be able to get emissions to net zero and to get to climate resilience, in my view. The first one is having clear objectives. Objectives for emission reductions and for adaptation and resilience. And committing to a net zero target, it's such a first step. However, it's important that those objectives are protected from political change, from elections, from changing priorities, and that's why legislating those goals, putting them into national climate laws, has been very important. The second element that we need is sustained political commitment to implementation of those goals, and importantly, buy-in from citizens, because politicians alone won't do it for us. We need actually the whole society understanding what we're trying to achieve and aligning behind it, so that we can have businesses, individuals, regions, cities actually moving towards implementation. And again, experience shows that climate change laws are a great vehicle to getting that broader societal buy-in, because by debating climate law, climate objectives in the parliament, by having public consultations, public participation processes, this is how we get objectives integrated into the broader society. And the growing trend of citizens' assemblies in Europe on climate change is an important driver in this transition. And the first element that we need accountability for implementation, because unless there is a clear mechanism that checks how well we're doing, where are the gaps, and actually keeps politicians and governments accountable and in check, goals may just remain on paper. And again, this is why we emphasize climate laws. Climate laws is an essential legal tool to ensure that countries don't backslide on their emission reduction and adaptation objectives. And they also allow litigation cases to be brought up in court. So governments are increasingly being challenged around the world when they fall behind in terms of national ambition and also in terms of implementation. So this is why we're talking about climate laws today, which are essential elements to ensure credibility and the speed of transition that is required. Now, at the Grantham Research Institute, we're keeping a database of laws and policies around the world which are climate-focused or climate-related. And we have seen exponential growth in lawmaking and policy-making activities. In 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, globally there were only 70 climate and climate-related policies and laws. Today, our database covers over 2,900 such laws and policies worldwide, and about 1,000 of them are legal instruments, so climate and climate-related laws. We're talking about Europe and Latin America today, and I'm pleased to say that those two regions have been on the upfront, kind of on the front foot of legislating on climate change and also policy innovation. Obviously, European experience starting with the UK Climate Change Act, and then more recently, many countries integrating net zero targets into their laws, such as France, Denmark, Spain, recently Portugal, Greece, many other European member states. They are leading on the legislative trend on climate change. But in Latin America, we had Chile put net zero targets into the national law, and also Colombia legislating climate neutrality. Mexico was the first emerging economy in 2012 to adopt the climate legislation, and there is also a lot of legal innovation in Latin America, in particular integrating provisions related to public participation, indigenous knowledge, for example, as in the case of Peruvian climate change law, and also addressing deforestation, as in the case, for example, in Colombia. And very importantly for Latin American countries, as well as for many countries in Europe, and particularly Spain and other Southern European countries, adaptation is an important focus in the framework laws, and this is one area where both regions can learn from each other. We have a great panel today to talk in more detail about what is happening in some of the countries, also with Brazil's election and of course Lula coming back to power. It's very important to see and very exciting to see how Brazilian legal frameworks and policy frameworks will develop on climate change. But what I would say, while each region faces their particular context and challenges, I think there are some common ones. Number one, I think, is both Latin America and Europe face the challenge of sustaining and increasing political buy-in from the population for what we're trying to achieve. With the growing support for populist and right-wing parties both in Europe and in South and Latin America, that task becomes ever more important. So this is one area I'm proposing is an important area for European and Latin American cooperation. How can we improve public participation in climate policy? How can we build on the experience of citizens' assemblies? The second area is integration of objectives into legislation. I mentioned in Europe and the European Union there are currently 10 countries which have legislated net zero targets. The rest of Europe is still lagging behind in this respect. So that is clearly a challenge for Europe going forward. Internalizing the European goal that is legislated in the European climate law into the national climate legislation. The same for Latin America. So obviously that is another area of collaboration. And finally, adaptation. I think, as I noted, this is a very big challenge, both for, in particular, Southern Europe and Latin America. And I think Europe can learn quite a lot from what is happening on adaptation in Latin America, and vice versa. Spain has had quite a lot of work done in this area, more than some other European countries. So that is clearly an area to build upon. And cross-cutting across that, what we need is credible knowledge and independent expert assessment of both the objectives and the progress which is being made, which is the cornerstone of the third element I mentioned, which is accountability that we need in order to implement the Paris Agreement. And here is my final area for collaboration that I'm proposing, which is around strengthening mechanisms for independent expert advice and independent advisory bodies. And here in Latin America, we already have excellent examples where Chile, Mexico, Guatemala, Costa Rica have established national expert advisory bodies which help the government with advice on objectives but also assess progress. Similarly, in Europe, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Iceland, Sweden, and UK, outside of the European Union but still part of Europe, fortunately. But many countries are lacking such independent advisory bodies, notably Spain is working on one, but that hasn't yet been fleshed out. So that is the final area for collaboration I'm putting forward. So in short, different challenges, but actually many common ones, and a lot of experiences that each of the regions can learn from each other. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much for that very broad and detailed overview. And I think it's worth bringing to this COP a reflection on how climate policies fare in a context of very uncertain and turbulent waters outside. And here I'm going to give the floor to Ines, who is going to present the work by IDOS and other think tanks and research institutions that are part of the ETTG, and to talk to us about the general context and how this might be affecting climate laws and the implementation of our climate commitments. Ines, thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for having me here. Is this okay? Good. So, yes, I will focus then a bit on EU policy making in the wake of the multiple crises that we are seeing. As you know, the world and Europe have seen the COVID pandemic, Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine, and then the related socioeconomic struggles. These crises have no doubt demanded a large amount of attention, capacity and financial resources, which is making to focus on the long-term crisis of climate change much more difficult. Throughout these recent years, the EU has committed to state its commitment to tackling climate change and has been continuously developing and releasing new measures to the implementation of the European Green Deal. So let me summarize the most important ones. First, the EU set into law its climate neutrality target to 2050. Then, through its Fit for 55 package, the member states aim to achieve greenhouse gas emission reduction target of 55% by 2030 relative to 1990. In a recent statement at the EU pavilion here, Franz Timmermans highlighted that this target must be pushed further and that 57% is now being more likely to be achieved. Also, the EU Commission on Energy noted that countries are ready to do more than originally planned for the energy transition. However, whether such ambition can be achieved in practice remains to be seen, especially given the multiple crises. So first of all, we all know that we have seen these skyrocketing energy prices. Energy prices already rose during the pandemic, but the Russian war against Ukraine and the related measures, of course, have very much increased this. As you know, the EU was dependent on Russia for 40% of its gas, almost half of its coal, and a third of oil. Now most of the gas supply has been cut off, and the EU aims to increase itself to free from fossil fuels by 2030. Although the response strategy, Repower EU, or through this response strategy, three main approaches are taken: clean energy, savings, and resource diversification. Now, the good news is that the crisis has forced the EU to speed up its plan for renewable energy deployment and energy savings. In that sense, it has proposed to increase its renewable share target from 40% to 45% by 2030, which is already an increase from the initial 32%. It has also proposed to boost its energy efficiency target from 9% to 13% by 2030 relative to 2020. In addition, the EU plans to almost quadruple its initial set of green hydrogen target, mostly through imports, signals the need for new partnerships. Finally, the EU aims to cut its gas consumption by 15% this year compared to the previous year. At least this winter's so far higher temperatures have certainly helped, although the focus on reduction was meant to target industries and not the households. So the bad news is that not being able to instantly switch away from gas, the EU had to find other gas suppliers, making new contracts and building new infrastructure. This is a concern for the long term, as it can create lock-ins, as you know, for gas. Moreover, more countries like Germany have resorted to continued use of coal. Although no EU member state has so far announced a delay in the coal phase-out deadline, the need for even more accelerated reductions later on would make the achievement of these deadlines much harder. Energy security and climate action go hand in hand. Had the EU acted sooner and stronger on decarbonizing its energy system before, it would now be in a much better situation. Now, the EU's recent external energy engagement strategy highlights multiple energy partnerships to tackle the energy crisis and shows the importance of international cooperation. Yet, there is little or no reference to Latin America. This could be a missed opportunity and perhaps something to work further on. Not least, Chile has shown high interest in green hydrogen production, although I also think it's a complicated situation in Chile regarding water supplies, for instance. Now, beyond its borders, the EU aims to show leadership and advance energy transitions worldwide. To that end, it has been involved in the development of Just Energy Partnerships JETPs. The JETP with South Africa has set a precedent for such cooperation, followed by the recent announcement of one with Indonesia. Other countries are on the list for potential future partnerships, but no Latin American country, which may also be a missed opportunity. While the energy crisis is most present now, other sectors and measures are also very important. Two other important areas are the carbon border adjustment mechanisms and the need to reduce imported deforestation. After China, the EU is the biggest importer of deforestation. The recently passed proposal to eliminate deforestation from 14 commodities, including soybean, timber, cocoa, and coffee, will have high implications on trade with Latin America as one of the main producers of these commodities. This will help deforestation in the area, yet this should go beyond forests to cover more ecosystems and will require strong verification and monitoring for the implementation. Similarly, the CBAM applied to iron, steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizers and electricity will have implications for the competitiveness of these projects based on their carbon footprint. To support partner countries and to stand for its desired leadership for the global transition, the EU would need to seek win-win solutions to help achieve industrial decarbonization and greening abroad. Now, the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine have not only had implications on the EU, but worldwide, of course. Moreover, EU's domestic measures do not only have implications for the EU, but also for relevant partner countries. For this reason, it is essential that crisis response measures and climate measures are taken with a consideration to implications and in cooperation with involved partner countries. The climate crisis, as the global crisis, requires global action and strong international partnerships. This does not mean that policy should be diluted, but rather that climate ambition should be supported abroad, in particular by boosting synergies with sustainable development. In a recent policy brief, we showed that the implementation of the European Green Deal in is EU's best ticket to address the multiple crises of the world and to tackle related challenges around food security, energy security, industrial supply chains and environmental protection. To boost that action and enhance resilience, policy coherence, social protection and international cooperation will be needed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ines. So with this sort of context on climate policies and the current situation, I give the floor to Sandra to talk to us through Mexico's new announcement and what can we expect out of it, and also I was going to pose a question to both you and Flavia on the strengthening of cooperation between EU and Latin America and the Caribbean, and how Spain can play a role in that beyond the current networks, technical networks. And yesterday at an event we reflected on how we can institutionalize perhaps at a higher level that network of climate change officers. So floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Alina and Lara, for the invitation to participate in this session. And of course, thank you so much for everyone to be here. I would like to start saying that we are in a moment where we recognize that we cannot face climate change in just an individual or unilateral way. We recognize that we need to build those capacities at all different levels, and of course collaboration and cooperation is critical for climate action. Mexico has been a country that has been creating alliances and collaboration with different countries, and that has been key, to really set some important moments in the government. But I would like to refer a little bit of the past of the collaboration with EU, what is the present, and what could be the future. Because I think it is important to say, yes, the cooperation has been important, but we also have to learn from the past, because not everything has been perfectly good. Like, we have to learn also from some elements that haven't necessarily been good. So let me refer to the energy transition. Mexico, as well as many countries in Latin America, still rely a lot on fossil fuels to generate revenue. Therefore, it's a country that has been investing a lot of money to keep building those, let's say, fossil systems. In that sense, the collaboration and the cooperation with EU, Spain particularly, to invest in renewable energy has been very, very important. However, in the past, in the absence of regulations, it was true that some projects, some companies had difficulties to put in place projects in the local ground, in the local level, because communities were not necessarily involved in the development of these projects. We had a lot of communities that were against of these renewable energy projects, particularly wind projects, because there was no regulation, there was not necessarily respect of the indigenous and local communities that were in the territory. And that was a major problem in Mexico, not only in the south, in Oaxaca, but also we have been observing some other experiences where not necessarily when the technology transfer or the technology is not the only thing that we have to take care. We have to think in, yes, it is important to generate this technology transfer, but we have to do it also based on principles. And I think this is one of the major lessons that we have in Mexico, because we know that we need those investments for sure, but we need to do it based on principles where we can really talk about sustainable development, when we really try to talk about transformation. In that sense, Mexico, as you know, is a country that has been battling. It has been really showing that climate change was a major element. We are an extremely vulnerable country. We are one of the major emitters in the region. But in Mexico, political changes matters. What we have been observing in Mexico is that depending on the government in the power, depends on let's say, the prioritization of climate change has been changing a lot. And this is one of the most important elements that we as civil society have been tracking, because as Alina said, accountability is critical. We have the goals. In Mexico, we have some goals, we have some targets related to the reduction of emissions, targets that now we updated. So before it was 22% of the reduction by 2030, and recently there was an announcement about the reduction of 35% by 2030, which generally speaking, it's a good news, because the target is there. Then we have a law. We have a climate change law. Mexico was the first country having this law. And of course, the point the problem is the implementation side. And this COP is all about implementation. Unfortunately, in Mexico, the implementation of the climate policy hasn't been as strong, as powerful as we wish. Why? Because some of the targets that we have now include actions or activities that are actually causing important environmental damages. For instance, in this new 35% of reduction of emissions, the government is including one project, the Tren Maya, probably you hear about that, the train, in the Maya train, which is in the southeast area of Mexico. And this train, it is important in the sense that it's going to create a connectivity between the center and the south of the country. However, this train is going to create a lot of deforestation, a lot of devastation in some of the most mega diverse areas in the country. So the problem in Mexico is not the lack of goals, it's not the lack of laws, it's the lack of clear implementation based on principles. How we are going to achieve a climate action without creating externalities. And bad externalities, not only in terms of emissions, but also in terms of biodiversity and other areas. So that's why, for me, as in the future, what can be done in collaboration with EU and other countries? So the first point is really create long-term support. What I'm saying long-term support is that sometimes we realize that Mexico receives sometimes one collaboration or one support for one project, but then after 1 year, that project doesn't receive any more support. And therefore, we have a lot of little interventions, but we are not having really transformational and long-standing interventions or collaboration. And I think this is important because countries like Mexico, like Brazil, Colombia, and others, we have a very constrained fiscal space to invest. And unfortunately, just to give you an example, Mexico, 15% of the total budget of the country is still carbon intensive. Mexico is still investing a lot of money on fossil fuels, and only 0.05% is related to energy transition. So the gap that exists in terms of investments is massive. We need that investment, but we need that investment in a way that is creating jobs, because it's not only a matter of transferring the technology, it's creating jobs, generating new industries at the local level, involving the communities, and really create a new whole transformational at the ground. This is one critical element, and we believe that EU can collaborate in generating those transformations, of course, like with a long-term perspective. And of course, we need financial innovation. As I was saying, the public money is not enough. Unfortunately, Mexico is very has a lot of debts. No, like this discussion that we are having in this COP is true. A lot of our countries are in debt, and it's how we are going to innovate, how we are going to create new financial mechanisms to really inject new capital, public and private investment, new mechanisms to really accelerate the access to financial mechanisms in a more innovative way. And I think EU and Latin America can work on that. And of course, it is very important to continue the technical support. I don't want to call it capacity building because there are capacities. In Mexico, there are a lot of capacities, but it's how can we contribute in the technical exchanges, technical support to really ensure that these transformations are continuous, not only 1 year and finish. No. How can we create constant collaboration that is really, really valuable for the country in the long run? Because at the end of the day, it's a win-win. No? We are in a world where it's not if you do or you do, it's how we are going to collaborate. So I think that the collaboration can really, really be transformative if we include the human rights perspective, if we embrace the local communities to the changes, and of course to really work at the local level with cities and other actors that are very important to achieve the transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. That was very inspiring, and I'm sure the two company representatives here will respond to how we're going to engage with communities in the future and the initiatives that they have on the table. But first, let me move on to Flavia. Flavia, we have a changing government in Brazil, no less. So I was wondering whether you could comment on the future of climate policy in Brazil and how it can further our joint collaboration in the future.
No.
Hello. Okay, I will switch. Can you help me here? Okay, that was on purpose, just to say that Brazil is back, on climate change agenda. So thank you so much, Alina, for inviting me to be here in that panel. It's a pleasure. There's a lot to say after Lula's announcement yesterday about the future of climate policy in Brazil. But I'd like to start just saying where we are right now in Brazil as climate policies and where should we head off and how we can embrace the relationship with EU and Spain in order to enhance the climate policy in Brazil. So we have been in the past 4 years, having like a non-climate agenda on federal level at all. However, we had like 2 good news that happened in Brazil, and it's quite historically. The first one, thanks to civil society, we are almost there to add in our federal constitution the term climate security in 3 different articles: the environmental article, the economics one, and the civil rights one in our federal constitution. So having that simple 2 words, climate security, in our federal constitution, it's something huge because it's going to open to us different ways to deal with climate change on a domestic level. And we have been like in the past 2.5 years working hard in order to around like 40 civil society organizations working really hard in order to bring to our federal constitution that's 2 words. Hopefully, by the end of this year or mid of next year, we are going to finish the entire process of this. And another thing that's really interesting that happened in Brazil, and it was last year, for the first time in history, the Supreme Court was voting the green package. And it never happened before. So we had around 7 different lawsuits that was like developed through parties in Brazil, from right wings and left wings, to point out what the government should be doing in order to protecting the Amazon or to restructuring the supervisory bodies as IBAMA and PPCD Those are two institutional bodies in Brazil that focus on deforestation, fiscalization, and we didn't have enough funds going to those institutions in the past years. So that's one of the reasons why deforestations were so high. We couldn't manage to fiscalize the way we should. And of course, Amazon is huge. Our biomes is huge. So we need plenty of technologies, plenty of fundings in order to be able to have a proper fiscalization in our Amazon. But even though we had the federal government not so keen on climate agenda, we still managed to have these two outsets that I found quite important, historically speaking, because it has never happened in Brazil before. And that opened some kind of legal ways that as Brazilians we can move forward with the agenda. And saying that, there is some good news about like the Lula's announcement yesterday. Of course, it's clear for everyone here that Brazil is on climate agenda again, and it's important to have a federal level keen on climate agenda, and more than that, understanding that it's not just the environmental minister job to develop climate agenda. It's the entire minister of the government. It's for every single agenda. Everyone should embrace climate change in a transversal way. Otherwise, you won't be able to move forward with the adaptation, mitigation, and SBN in Brazil. So, but now that we have, not now, because we're in a transition moment, but like after 1st of January, we are gonna have a government that is keen on climate agenda, but it's still, Brazil is massive. Just to you to have an idea, we have 5,570 municipalities in our country. It's a lot. And the majority of them are small municipalities, and they do not have technical capacities, they do not have even funds in order to embrace climate agenda in a domestic level. So even though we have almost 6,000 municipalities in Brazil, we had like around 30, 40 of them developing the inventory, climate action plan, risk and vulnerability assessments, and there are really important studies in order to develop public policies. Without knowing your inventory or risk assessment or a climate action plan, it's really hard to develop straight away public policies on climate agenda because we don't know exactly where we should focus on. So, and it costs, and we have been through international cooperation, being able, even the European Union as well, being able to bring those efforts in a domestic level in Brazil, but still we have a long way to go. And another thing that has happened in the past years as well, and in my view was like the most important work we have been doing there in a state level is what we call the governors for climate. So we managed to have 26 governors in Brazil, and Brasilia, it's like a district, so it's not a state, but we had like 27 governors, and we managed to bring 24 of them signing a climate commitment. And that was really helpful as well in order to move forward the agenda, even though we had tough 4 years to develop climate change on the ground. That saying, we need the federal level, the state level, the municipal level in order to develop the agenda. And it's challenging in a country as Brazil that is continental. We have like 6 biomes, we have the diversity, we have the indigenous people, quilombolas people, the peripheral areas. You know, it's like every single place in Brazil, there is its own specific challenge, but we need to understand the big picture and try to bring down in a domestic level that agenda the way we should, in a way to respect the local communities, in a way to respect like the local cultures, and even so being able to develop the agenda. Another thing that has happened in Brazil as well that it's like quite interesting, we are hoping as well that with the new Lula, under the new Lula's government, Brazil has a way, I don't know if it's good or not, but everything that happens in the US, you can count down, it's going to happen in Brazil somehow. So saying that, we might know, we are quite sure that we are going to have like a special envoy for climate change, and it's going to be interesting, so we can bring down in a strategic way the climate agenda in different levels. And also, because we have now the political will, that it's a really good step. It's going to be easy to break down that political will, because mayors and governors are going to understand better the importance of the agenda. And we have the Supreme Court looking at this. We are going to add in our federal constitution as well the climate security. It's still the legal body of Brazil is not well developed on climate agenda yet. So that's why we founded La Clima, for example, that climate law network, because we want to enhance that knowledge in order to help the municipalities, the government, and even companies to have consistency on their climate action plans. Because this way we are going to be able even to find better funds, and we are going to be more straightforward in order to develop exactly what we must do in Brazil. There is no time anymore to elucubrate, why we should do. We know exactly what we should do in Brazil. Deforestation, decarbonization, and clean energy. And we do have the tools to develop this. But still, legally speaking, there is a massive gap in Brazil. We are like baby steps right now. And we know the importance of developing the legal scheme there in order to strengthen the process. So we had in our network for La Clima, for example, we have already 800 people, from law students to lawyers and other people who works on law issues, coming together in different working groups, helping public policies, helping government, helping company in order to strengthen that agenda. So we need everyone. It's really hard not to just do by ourselves as Brazil. And that's why international cooperation is so important, because we need, for example, if the EU or even Spain, that we already, historically speaking, we have a really good relationship with Brazil and Spain. So it's already like a permanent relationship. But strengthen the knowledge sharing, or even through the knowledge sharing, how we can even like access funds on this. And I think the two key elements in that international cooperation that we must have, it's green jobs and climate technologies. We need a massive amount of money in order to develop adaptation, mitigation, and resilience process. We need the private sector, we need the public sector, we need the international finances for that. But we keep forgetting the importance of developing and strengthening the green jobs locally. And I think that's the key thing for international cooperation. How can we embrace with Spain and Brazil, and how can we develop that field, Because there is a WRI shows a research a few months ago saying that with the green jobs, today with the jobs made from oil, we had around like 7 million jobs on Latin America. But green jobs are going to bring to us around 16. It's much, much more. It's double times those jobs. So we have space for that, and we must embrace that. So through international cooperations is a way to show Brazil that we have enough resources and we have space to develop this, and do so we can even strengthen the economic of our country, and we can strengthen the international relations as well. And through this we have technology. Brazil, there is like plenty of universities who is developing interesting technologies on climate change in a domestic level, looking at the sea, the oceans, and even smart cities. We have plenty of things going on, but it's still creating that bridge to bring technology from European Union, Spain to Brazil and vice versa. It's a way to try to save time and money and resources. And I cannot see that conversation that do not go smoothly the way it should be. But because we already have a good connection within our countries, there is already an open door for that. So I think if I should pick like two topics to strengthen the relationships between Spain and European Union with Brazil, it's going to be green jobs and climate technologies, so we can exchange knowledge on that. So it's really nice as a Brazilian sitting here, and saying that Brazil is back on climate agenda, but it doesn't mean that now the work starts. We have been doing the best as we could in the past years in order to keep the agenda somehow, in specific municipalities, trying to fix things with the governments. But now that we are back in the big picture and the politicians are understanding the geopolitical issue, talk about climate change, we are going to have loads of work. So that's why it's really important to have you by our side to develop that agenda as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Flavia, and I am sure with everything that you've raised and the initiatives that I know are ongoing, both at Iberdrola and Solaria, we can talk about not only the impacts of climate change on businesses, but the reactions to climate change, the solutions that you bring to the table, and how you guys are addressing the issues of social acceptance and green jobs and local jobs that provide the communities that engagement and that acceptance of this low carbon transition. Miguel.
Thank you. My voice after 2 weeks in the Spanish pavilion. So thank you, Lara, for this question. So many things have been said in the panel, so many interesting things. I will pick up on some of them. Of course, we are struggling in a very difficult context with surging energy prices, inflation, the starting of some ralentization or recession in some jurisdictions. And I think that our best response as businesses and maybe as a society would be to accelerate energy transition, no? Especially through renewables or smart solutions to improve energy savings, energy efficiency. But this is not so easy, as we have mentioned. There are different policy frameworks, and we should in some way pay special attention to local context. Because if we don't have a profound dialogue with local stakeholders, if we don't build this energy transition under a social and environmental perspective, we will fail in achieving the necessary speed to tackle this process. And that's what we as a business understood when we were trying to relaunch our ambition. We presented last week our new plan, net zero emissions in all our activities by 2040 and in scope 2 and 1 by 2030, mostly focused on an acceleration of our investments in renewables. We understood that if we want to meet these goals, we have to work with local stakeholders and to make of our investments in renewables in all our jurisdictions an opportunity to create social positive impact and also environmental and biodiversity positive impact. We launched in June 2022 our plan called Convive. In this way, the noun is very encouraging, no? We have to, in some way, coexist and to co-create with local communities. We have an internal working group with our businesses that assess every local plan, every local community, and understands what are the impacts in terms of biodiversity and social jobs, former activities that are changed when you install a plant, a windmill, etc. So we understood this as a very important topic. For social acceptance, of course, we were talking all this time about social acceptance. When we are talking about green jobs, I like to link this especially to a problem that we are facing in Europe, but also I think it's very common in Latin America. We are talking about a scarcity of skills or a huge need of reskilling professionals that are in industries that in some way will suffer the impact of this energy transition. In this context, we have very interesting programs. I will highlight some of them. We have, for example, in Brazil, a very interesting project that is called the School for Electricians. It is focused on women and we provide training for 300 women every year to give them the certification of electrician. Most of them are hired by Iberdrola, and we have awarded by UN with a very interesting award on this initiative now. And also we are supporting in different jurisdictions. We have an agreement in Mexico with Universidad Autónoma and also with the Institute of Renewables there to promote STEM careers, especially for women that we know that in some cases have some special difficulties to get access to this kind of degrees. Beyond that, I would like to highlight a very important initiative that was launched some weeks ago, but it was especially highlighted yesterday. It is a pact for green jobs creation, especially in youth employment, and it was launched yesterday by ILO, UNIP, and UNICEF, and it has the goal to start by creating 1 million new jobs between the youth community, and also to provide tools to promote entrepreneurship in the green areas. This pact will gather multilateral institutions, but also have invited companies to join there to provide our expertise in activities in business areas, and it will be a very important conversation that we will join in the coming months. So we think that especially for social acceptance, for green jobs or just transition, we could say also under a broader term, these kind of elements are important. Beyond that, the transition should be accelerated, and in some way we should ask for policy frameworks. You have been talking about climate laws, but also when we implement these climate laws, we should go more in detail how we can accelerate the permitting, the administrative processes. In Europe, we are facing this problem. In general, we see that we have the Repower EU with very ambitious goals to tackle the crisis, especially after the Ukraine war. We see that it continues. It takes a lot of time to deploy a plan or windmill, etc. So we have to tackle this. And last but not least, I would like to talk about, we have been talking about capacity building, sharing good experiences, the importance of alliances. We are, as businesses, part of different alliances that are connected between Europe and Latin America. I would like to highlight one example, the Corporate Leaders Group in Europe. We have a very good connection with Corporate Leaders Group Europe and Corporate Leaders Group Chile, and we are sharing best practices in terms of policy advocacy, in terms of business practices across all sectors. From a business perspective, it's also to close ties between associations and business associations in Europe and Latin America, since both regions share a lot of interest in the energy transition. We see in Latin America a huge potential of renewables, a huge potential in minerals that are essential for this green transition, and some ground for collaboration could be financial, de-risking tools, good practices in businesses, good practices in regulation and goal setting. So very interesting conversations ahead to promote this acceleration of energy transition.
Thank you, Miguel. A whole host of initiatives to respond to previous comments. And I'm sure that David, who is our last speaker, but by no means least, will complement on that. And we shared a panel with Solaria a few weeks ago, and I was struck by one of the initiatives that you're undertaking when you do deploy your PV plants in Spain, which is also enabling communities to invest in the plant. And I think that is probably something that might be of interest. I don't know what the reactions from Brazil and Mexico would be on this, but I would like to give you the floor now to comment on the solutions and how you're addressing these very important issues of social acceptance and green jobs, and including communities. Thank you, David.
Okay, I'll go for it, but let me first give you a brief introduction. I do fully agree with all of you, and we have to create a bridge between Latin America and Europe. But in order to fork a very good bridge and a strong bridge, we have to do things in the right way, in the right manner. And I'm going to focus on how to do the right things here in Europe, because it's the main place where we are working, but then I will go to Latin America. And from Solaria, from our perspective, we think that we need something as revolutionary as what the founding fathers of the European Union did 70 years ago. It's to forge a new European Union project based on renewable energies. And we should not forget that the European Union was based on energy. It was founded on coal, on nuclear energy, on so why we cannot go for the new idea of recreating, reforging the European Union based on renewable energies? My company, Solaria, is focused on solar photovoltaic solar energy. And we think that it is obvious that renewable energies fight against global warming. They bring sovereignty for all nations, which is national security. You don't need to buy oil, you don't need to buy petrol, you don't need to buy uranium. It's in solar radiation and wind. You have all natural products to create energy, and you get very cheap energy. So it is obvious that the foundation of our nations can be based on these new energy technologies. I think, summing up, that energy once again will recourse the European Union. And if we create alliances, international alliances focused on Latin America, we can do all together at the same time, because this is the key moment for forging the new international project based on renewable energies. And it can be an international solution, not a national solution. So what are the pitfalls for doing these things in the right way? The pitfalls in Europe are the permitting. We are investing more than 3 years in getting permissions for installing a solar plant. And 3 years is a long way. We should not wait for more than 6 months, 7 months in order to get permissions. And we are waiting between 2 and 3 years. So there is no way we can reach the necessary amount of solar megawatts we need before 2030 if we have to wait for years in order to get administrative licensing. So we need a kind of bureaucratic, political, industrial agreement to get solar and wind plants licensed in less than 6-8 months. We have high expectations on the European Commission proposal for a council regulation laying down a new framework to accelerate deployment of renewable energy in Europe, and this is the right way to harmonize regulation. The second pitfall we have is social licensing. We have been talking about this. Solar plants occupy land, yes, indeed, and they have some environmental and landscape impacts. Nobody denies that. That is the reason why some civil society organizations are having negative views on this industry. However, we know that, but we should not forget that no success in energy plants without externalities. All plants, energy plants, have externalities and opportunity cost. But we firmly believe that our opportunity costs are very, very little and can be transformed into social and economic benefits for local societies. And let me explain how can we get this. And this is the question that Lara asked me. It is obvious that developers of photovoltaic solar parks must take into account that only plants determined by sustainability and with limited environmental impact will be acceptable by social and local communities. Solaria does all the necessary to establish a fluid dialogue with those communities where solar plants are settled down. There is an obligation for business firms, it is an obligation, that's the way we believe it, to build up social legitimacy in our sector, just for one reason, because the generation of profits will have to be both for society and for the companies that risk their capital developing renewable energies. Photovoltaic can be an engine of rural development as well as it helps to establish population. Flavia gave us a data of how many jobs can be created by renewable energies, and we are proving that. Not only direct employees, but also indirect jobs, because electricity prices fall down immediately. So you can create a lot of industries with very cheap prices and create it in a very clean way. So in nearby communities, we've been proving here in Spain that we're creating jobs. In addition, the generation of photovoltaic social energy fits perfectly with circular economy, based on economic model that pivots on reducing waste of a minimal and promotion environment. Besides, we believe in a concept that probably you all have heard before, which is agrovoltaic. Agrovoltaic is the connection between agriculture and photovoltaic solar energy. So we include agricultural activities into the locations of our plants. We preserve local activities, and we have the ability for shepherds of land with photovoltaic installation, refugee areas to regenerate native biodiversity and protect pollinating species like bees, which are essential for the sustainability of agricultural activity, hosting of protected crops of native species. So all these things can be combined with renewable energies, conservation actions of the land, fauna, and flora. We know that our villages, our citizens, and our communities must get, feel, and enjoy the benefits of our clean, cheap, and modern technology. Summing up, we must take advantage of this current dramatic situation to rebuild the European Union on a new social, political, and industrial agreement that puts renewable energies at the center of the board. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. With that, I would like to give the floor to the audience, because I think we have an excellent panel of speakers. If you don't have questions, I have a bunch of questions, so please just raise your hand and the mic will come to you. No questions from the audience. Okay, well, that is interesting, and I'm afraid you'll have to stick with my questions then. So I will start with a general reflection on all of your interventions. You've talked about how we know exactly what we have to do. The IPCC has been painfully clear in that we are seeing a litany of broken promises. We are facing a climate crisis, and we have a future in which we have to decide where we want to go, and we have to decide it not against sectors and people, but with sectors and people. And I would like to ask each and every one of you how, from your expert perspective, we can create that space for consensus in which we can build further ambition. I know it's quite a general question, but I would like you to not only reflect on the general, but also give me a particular example that has sparked your interest and optimism lately. So for me, I think the just transition contracts that have been modeled on the French energy transition law that we're seeing in Spain is a reason to be optimistic. Of course, things have issues with implementation, and we are putting forward the idea of socio-environmental contracts for those communities that are going to be part of the low-carbon transition in implementing renewables. So I'll pass the mic on to Alina, and in the same order, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. So for me, the example that gives me optimism is something I briefly mentioned earlier, is the rise of citizens' assemblies on climate change in Europe. For those of you who don't know, citizens' assemblies are drawn by lottery, like citizen jury duty, to make up the average composition of country's population by age, education, gender, political preferences. And they come together and deliberate on different issues on climate change. And we had a wave of them in Europe recently, in a number of countries, most recently in Spain, actually. What gives me optimism is that citizens in every single climate assemblies have come up with recommendations which in many ways are more ambitious than what politicians have been prepared to do. So we're actually being very conservative and underestimate how far we can go and how far citizens are able to go, provided they are given information about what we're facing in terms of climate change, and they're clear what needs to be done.
Thank you, Lina. Ines?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm also very fond of the citizen councils, and heard about very good things about the respective councils in Germany, and laypersons then explained in the radio later how they changed their views during these councils, and it offered completely new perspectives. So it's also a great program of educating population, so to say. And I find it very interesting that you analyzed this in terms of ambition levels that could be set through these councils. Now, what also was a factor of optimism for me was Fridays for Future before the pandemic, and really this surge of young people really demanding greater change. I think it has slowed down a bit through the pandemic, and now we are maybe at a critical point to see how it will continue in face of the new crisis, in view of the Ukraine crisis. Here I have the impression that, you're asking for optimism, but I have the impression that in Germany the just transition discussion in terms of just energy transition is maybe focusing still a little bit too much on the workers who would be phased out through the transition, and is not maybe embracing enough the young generations that want to move into other jobs and green jobs in the future. And I think here we can still try to foster that collaboration a bit more.
Thank you. Sandra?
Thank you so much. I definitely think that I'm hopeful, because I think that every time there is more and more people working and understanding what is the problem. And for me, civil society is the memory of climate change, because governments changed. Governments change every 4, 5, 6 years, depending on which country do you live. And when governments change, obviously the priorities change. But if you have a strong civil society, you will keep those memories, you will keep those, actions, and you can continue pushing for them. I'm just gonna give you an example. For instance, Mexico is going to have elections in 2024, and a group of organizations, we are putting together a decarbonization and climate resilient plan, because what we want is to ensure that whoever comes to the power in Mexico, they have to take climate change at the top of the priorities. And our message is that we cannot vote for anyone if they do not have the climate change as part of the key priorities. And I think that's one of the superpowers that we have as citizens. Vote, and vote for those that represent us, and vote for those that really going to set the agenda that is the beneficial for all. So that's what keeps me hopeful, because I do believe that in not only in Mexico, but in Latin America, we are more really pushing towards more stronger, not only policies, but stronger implementation plans. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love this idea of voting as a superpower and civil society as holding governments to account. Flavia?
Thank you. Just following the civil society base here, because I do think the change comes from the base, but I've been studying and working with climate justice in the past, almost 10 years, and I do see the world with that lens, through that lens. So I invite everyone always to bring that glasses, and keep it forever. And I do think that's what brings me hope, because I've seen the voices of the diversity of those who haven't been heard enough, being louder and louder, more and more. And I can see change happening throughout this. So I think that's one of the tools that brings me hope. And just saying about votes, there's an interesting thing that happens in Brazil for that last election. In Brazil, if you are 16 years old, you are not obligated to vote. But if you are 18 or plus, you are obligated to vote. But in Brazil, 2 million young people with 16 years old, they took their title to be able to vote for climate. And that's beautiful. Like really, you're not obligated to do that, but it's still, you went there and you took your title and 2 million young people voted for this. And I think that's like the most beautiful example I can share here because it's really, really powerful.
Miguel.
Very briefly, we think we have underestimated the power of local dialogue. As a company, we have realized that when you promote a robust and rigorous local dialogue, you can get a lot of things in energy transition. We have a very beautiful experience in Lada. It was a coal facility that we closed, and we launched a platform called Social Innovation Platform, facilitated by a university, Politecnica University in Madrid. And we gather within this platform local citizens, trade unions, companies, NGOs, and they discussed on the solutions that they wanted for their communities, providing some key elements. The facilitator gathered some of the results and is studying what they can develop, taking into account these preferences, this problem, this context. So I think we should work more on this line because we can get a lot of things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
David.
I would like to give some data to civil society to remark the close linkages that we have to set up. 15 years ago, to construct 1 megawatt of photovoltaic solar energy, it cost 6 million euro. These days, you can construct, to build up 1 solar megawatt with €500,000. So this means that it's becoming very efficient. Second figure, the size of solar panel has the energy standard size solar panel has increased for 250 watts to 500 watts. That means that every year we produce more solar energy in less space. We occupy less land. Every single, I will say not year, but every 3 or 4 years, we can produce more energy with less space. And third data, we can construct 100 megawatts in less than 9 months. That's very fast. Imagine that to build up a nuclear power plant, it takes about 15 years and 15 million euros. So with €500,000, you can have 1 solar megawatt in less than 9 months. 100 megawatts if you invest more. So these are just some data in order to underline that we are facing a real climate energy, and that we have to stop to reverse these destructive climate trends, and we need to accelerate the ecological energy transition thanks to a kind of a strategic relationship between civil society and those businessmen and those governments that firmly believe in renewable energies.
Thank you, David. I see we have one question from the floor, and Elena.
Can you hear? Yeah. Okay, so I think I actually have two questions.
Oh, 2 questions. Great.
So the first question is, since we're going to have the Spanish presidency of the EU next year, in a way, some kind of wishes from the panel on kind of like what would you like to be on the agenda, that, you know, what things matter and you think could make a difference if we manage to succeed, particularly from Latin America, but also from the people in Spain, and also, of course, from Ines and Alina as a kind of outside view, or from the EU itself. And I think the second question, which I think ties very nicely with the discussion we just had on citizens and how fundamental they are for the transition, is what do you think about the potential and how can we speed up energy communities, which is one of the drivers at the moment, you know, to kind of really become, you know, because I think, although of course it's limited in the sense of what I think the kind of behavioral changes and what it means in terms of empowering people, I think can be quite powerful. And as we know in Europe, because of REPowerEU, is going to be changed. I mean, this is actually being changed as we speak in Spain. and what could it mean for Latin America? Like in Brazil, if you have 5,000 municipalities, it could be a very interesting opportunity.
Thank you. Does anyone want to answer? And yes, Sandra.
Thank you so much. I would like to address the question about the energy communities. Two comments. The first one is, if we really want to tackle the climate emergency, we cannot think in the energy transition as these huge projects, like now let's put wind like mills all over the place, all of solar panels all over the place, because we are going to just restart the problems that we had in the past. I think we have to concentrate in two elements. Obviously, we have to continue working in energy efficiency and the reduction of consumption. Because there is this idea that, okay, because people is increasing the consumption of electricity, now let's put solar power everywhere. And that's not the solution of the climate emergency. We have to really reduce the consumption, energy efficiency, and work a lot in the decentralization of the energy access. In Mexico, we still have 3 million of people living without electricity. And solar and wind, solar energy particularly, it's going to be critical to achieve the access to this energy and electricity to really help communities. Actually, in Mexico, in the south, in Oaxaca, there are communities that have been trying to access to financial support to have like local, for instance, renewable energy projects to fulfill the necessities at the community level, because they are not, they don't need lots of electricity. They just need enough to have to develop all their activities. So I think this is a great opportunity to also accelerate cooperation, to help at that level, and really that's to reduce the energy vulnerability, because this is a problem, and this is still a huge problem if you go to rural or indigenous communities that they do not have access to electricity. So definitely that's a critical element. And that goes obviously in terms of the solidarity. Like sometimes big companies are looking for these massive projects, but we are forgetting the social and the human rights perspective. But if you really promote the energy transition, the just transition, you have to be able to really support those local actors and not only concentrate in these massive projects, because those are not necessarily the only solution. You will need it at certain level, but you don't need thousands of millions of winds everywhere, because you are going to destroy the biodiversity and the ecosystem. So we have to reframe what is really the transformational energy systems that we really need all over the world. Yeah, thank you.
Miguel.
I would like to pick up first on the first question. It's very relevant. We are now finalizing this COP, and we are heading to the next, thinking about the role that the Spanish presidency will have there. And I think it will be a remarkable role, since the next year we will have as a key element the global stock take. It will be a global revision of our action and how we are meeting the gaps or closing the gaps that we are facing in terms of ambition, implementation, finance. And I think that the Spanish government can play a key role within Europe, since they have presented very ambitious packages of policies, and they are leading in some way the energy transition or the green transition. So I think that Spain will play a key role, and we as companies will be happy to support at next COP this role. Regarding energy communities, what we see is that if we want to meet the net zero emissions goal, as Lara has highlighted at the beginning of the event, we cannot only rely on the traditional projects, huge projects. We have to look at our options, starting by the first energy efficiency principle. We always say when we are talking about infrastructure that we should take into account the first energy efficiency principle as a key step, and after all, looking at all sizes, paying particular attention to the local context. At the beginning of my intervention, I said that when we think about projects at local level, we should think about social positive and biodiversity positive. So we have taken into account these kind of elements, we could work in different fields.
Flavia and then Ines, and we'll have to quickly wrap up because we're running out of time.
I'm going to be briefly, just to bring an example that I'd like to invite you all to search about Brazil. There is a city called Niterói. It's like close to Rio de Janeiro, and they're developing the climate bank in the most poorest area of the city. And it's really amazing what they're doing there. So they're bringing like the decentralization of energy, and they are bringing green jobs, and they are provoking those houses to change to be more sustainable, but in exchange to some climate kind of money that they are developing that local community. It's a work that I've been doing with the City Hall, together with the private sector, together with the civil society. It's a really interesting model that I'd like to invite you all to look a little bit, to search a little bit, because I think it's a really great and practical and concrete example of what I've been saying here in that last question.
And Ines?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question on the Spanish EU presidency. And as a German citizen, I would say I think it is a very crucial moment also for the EU, because the EU is facing pressures which it has not faced before, and it's facing. It has seen increasing tensions among its member states during the last years already, and it's the war on Ukraine has not made the situation better but worse. And I think we are seeing shifts in the role of Germany and of the German-French relations. I hope that's not a permanent situation, but maybe only a small transitional crisis. But I would think that maybe Spain can play a role as a bridge maker in Europe, and Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Northern, Southern, as a relatively large country, and also a leader in the energy transition. I think a lot of solidarity will be needed in the energy sector, and that would be wonderful if Spain could play a role here. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. So we are giving the Spanish presidency quite a few roles, not only dealing with the European Green Deal that has to survive well after we are climate neutral continent. We are giving it the role of that push in the global stocktake, but also as a bridge builder. I think those are very powerful messages. I want to thank you all for being here today. I think I would end with a note on how important science is driving all of this, and the role of the IPCC, the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, hopefully developing the Article 37 of the Spanish Climate Change and Energy Transition Law, and having our own advisory body that has teeth to drive the agenda forward, and also held civil society and holding governments to account. I'm very inspired by the examples, and quite aware of the importance of engaging with communities and having that social license to undertake the transition, not only out of fossil fuel sectors, but also into renewable sectors, and the role the incredibly important role that climate policy, climate laws have in doing all of this. And thank you all of you for being here today. It's been an absolute pleasure and delight.